The great work of transformation can be achieved either from the outside in or the inside out. The ordinary approach is from the outside in. It's ordinary because the ordinary illusion is that there is an outside world. It's that illusion itself that is being transformed. But because one begins with that illusion, one attempts to make that illusion less chaotic, more orderly, more fair, just, more pure, bring more goodness, more maturity, more responsibility to one's world. And through the approach to sadhana as a general project of transformation of a being in a world, the more that one makes one's way of life accurate and in accord with the Dharma that brings one into a rational way of living, the less one needs to pay attention to the outer levels of life, because one will have determined to fulfill one's responsibilities. And therefore there will be no question, should I get to class, or should I sleep in, or should I fulfill my responsibilities in seva today, or should I not? Or should I do it carefully or carelessly? All of that will have been determined in advance. One will become a virtuoso of one's life. And therefore one will not have to think about what one does during the day. It will all happen according to what should happen. And therefore the mind will remain free to be in the subtler and deeper states of consciousness and begin to do the work of inner transformation. But first, the outer world has to be cleared of disturbances by creating a personality that encounters and interacts with that world that will not create disturbances. The ego is basically a disturbance foisted upon the world, because the ego is generally not in a friendly, cheerful, peaceful, loving state. It's always in some disturbed state, whether that's of anguish or fear or anger or sadness or some other negative relational tendency is being projected into the world and producing disturbances in the field and doubts within the minds of other egos. Did I do something wrong to cause that one to be angry or sad or upset or rejecting? And thus the disturbances of one ego are contagiously transmitted to others. And this produces disturbances that then will return to the one who first emitted that disturbance, and that's called karma. But the ego loves its karma and its disturbances, because being that that's all it is a disturbance, peace is a threat to its illusory existence. And thus the more that life is made orderly and one's personality is made compassionate, caring, loving, not needy, not rejecting, not angry, not feeling some inferiority plus superiority complex that are in oscillation in order to be able to reject the other from all directions. So long as the ego is still stuck in these kinds of charades, there can be no peace, and therefore the sadhana, the work of real transformation, remains simply an imaginary signifier that is used for purposes perhaps of prestige or perhaps of avoidance, but never achieves the aim that is its nominal destination. And the project of transformation fails because the transformation requires the elimination of the disturbance that the ego is. And so, as one proceeds deeper within and recognizes all of these traps that the personality has caused one to fall into, and one begins to recognize that the outside world is nothing but a projection of the inner world, then whatever feedback one is getting about oneself from the outside world is feedback that will enable one to let go of the disturbances that one has been projecting and which are returning in waves of dissatisfaction about one that is coming from external sources. Once it is recognized that the world's projection is determined by one's own thoughts, then one begins to do the inner sadhana. It's called the abhyasa, the real practice. And the core of the real practice is to begin to notice one's thoughts at the moment that they arise, not after they have been projected onto a world and produced karma, but before they turn into karma at an external level. And to be able to recognize those thoughts that are false and that produce karma, and those thoughts that resolve and eliminate karma. And the focus on producing only those kinds of mental actions that eliminate karma become the core focus of tapasya, the core of the abhyasa, which is to sustain the fire of yoga. And that happens through refusing to emit a particular kind of thought. And that kind of thought is technically called a vishaya vritti, a movement of the mind which projects an object. It won't seem like a projection of an object to the ego in a gross state of consciousness. It will seem like the perception of an object, a person, a thing. But even a mental object becomes recognized as the cause of the particularity of the appearance of a physical object, because we are always projecting subtle thoughts upon those beings who we perceive as being outside of us. But they are only outside of the ego's conscious mind and are always covered with projections of its subconscious mind. And thus the ego is always only relating to its own subconscious in the form of an external world and other people. But it never sees anything but its own other half of consciousness. And this is why it's both easy to fall in love, because one is always seeing one's other half, and it's easy to fall into hatred, because one is seeing one's other half. But it's the other half of the false self, not the real self. It's the other half of the self that perceives the self as an object, a me that was originally perceived with negative attributes by others, starting with those in the family system. And those self-images of the self as an object to the other then get projected upon the other in an act of vengeance upon those who projected on you long ago. And thus the world becomes a war of projections, but a war that is being fought behind one's own back because it is done subconsciously and self-righteously so that one can blame the other and have righteous anger and righteous rejection and abandonment, and righteously feel like, no, this isn't good, the other person is not treating me right, and to feel insulted because one is seeing one's own subconscious insulting aspects of superiority or betrayal of the other. And thus all of one's moral judgments are judgments against the self, but they are not copped to as such. And this is what creates all of the conflicts in the world. But when one recognizes that there is no world, and that the illusion of the world can be eliminated by the resolution of all the inner conflicts, then one leaves the ego for the soul level of consciousness and begins to do the real work. But the real work at its core is the elimination of the production of any thoughts which project an object. And so instead of Vishaya vrittis, one begins to recognize that one has a choice to emit and produce an Atma vritti. An Atma vritti is that thought that is self-awareness, not a thought of an object, but the thought of the self. But the self not as subject, because the subject is always subject to an object, but that realization of the self that is actually the refusal to project a vritti. So paradoxically, the Atma vritti is the ceasing of the production of all vrittis. But to the mind that is beginning to approach that level, it looks like there's a shift. It looks like it has to make some effort. It is actually the elimination of all effort. It is the doing nothing, the thinking nothing, but the realization of that power of thought that remains potential rather than actualized, the power of consciousness, the power of realization. And by abiding in that consistency of silent awareness of awareness, the tendency to produce objectifications and therefore karma is gradually or quickly eliminated. And the elimination of that tendency, which always produces suffering, is what is experienced first as peace, and literally a relaxation of body tensions and stress that is projected into the body and produces illnesses as a result of these negative projections. But it is also then, as one delves deeper into the source of consciousness, the realization of Satchitananda, the blissful self that is beyond thought, beyond all worlds, beyond creation, that transcendent presence that is all-knowing, but that never has to think in order to know, because what it knows is always only itself. But once the self has reclaimed all of its projections, what remains is only luminous, creative intelligence, without karma, beyond time or space. And it's that liberated consciousness then that has the power to redream a world that is beautiful, that is divine, that is loving, that is true, that is pure. A Sat Yuga. But only one who has achieved Sat, who has achieved a sattvic mind, who has achieved that power of mastery over the mind, and who refuses to fall back into projections, either of love or hate, but remains in that state of the recognition of the transcendent presence that is present in every point of space and time, because all of space and time is a projection of the oneself. It is that glory of the realization that the outer is the inner, that the world is only the self, that enables that world to become a manifestation of the beauty of God, rather than a manifestation of the hell realm of the ego. And it is this transformation that is the gift that the yogi gives. But to whom is it given? It can only be given to oneself in one's own manifest form as the fractal hologram of the world itself. And so it is more than just a truism to recognize that giving love to the other through the recognition that the other is the manifestation of God is the giving of love to oneself and the elimination of all disturbances that will inevitably come back to cause one's own suffering. And that the only strategy of living that is rational is that of unconditional love that sees no objects but recognizes only the one self in its luminous form of absolute Sundaram. And to bow in reverence to that truth in every form that it encounters. Because one is always encountering God everywhere and in everyone as one's own infinite projected power of an intelligence that is able to produce forms of beauty that are astonishing and infinite in their power of bringing joy and fulfillment to the hearts of all beings. May we co-create such a world through the recognition of this truth, that the world is our work of art, and become true virtuosos of the art of creation.